Lakeview performs its ordinary rituals beneath a pale Midwestern sun. Lawns ripple under sprinkler arcs. Dogs nose at chain-link fences and school buses hum past like yellow beetles with patient eyes. The town pretends that nothing bad can stick to it for long. On Maple Drive, the air smells of cut grass and detergent drying on a clothesline. A newspaper sleeps on a porch step, one house down from number 314. Inside 314, the quiet is too polished. There are no crumbs on the kitchen counter, no jackets slung over chair backs, no half-filled glasses by the sink. The loaf of bread on the cutting board has hardened into a pale stone. Dust has been chased from the baseboards, yet something has settled anyway, an invisible film of denial, a varnish of order. Neighbors begin with polite concern, then move to complaint, and at last resignation curdles into fear. A smell has been drifting from the home of Mark Lewandowski. Not the quick reek of a spoiled bin, not a dead mouse in a wall, but a layered odor with the patience of a sermon-sour old human. The scent is a story that no one wants to finish reading. Officer Selena Ortiz parks by the curb, a blue silhouette in a summer shimmer. Detective Claire Raddick joins her calm and unhurried shoulders squared the way people stand when they must enter a room that might rearrange their lives. They knock, they wait. The wind answers for the house. They circle to the back. The door keeps a secret the way a mouth keeps a pill under its tongue. The lock yields. Silence steps aside like a butler. Claire notes how the kitchen light, when switched on, flickers and resigns itself to dimness as if afraid of seeing too much. She notices the bread, the immaculate sink, and the absence of ordinary mess. The smell follows them down the hall, a faithful dog that no one wants. It gathers at the end of the corridor where a door sits sunken into the wall, painted the same color as the trim, eager to be mistaken for nothing at all. The basement staircase is a throat cut from wood. A bulb tries to live and fails. Flashlight beams carve slow tunnels through dust. Steps answer with small complaints. The air grows dense as though it remembers being water. At the foot of the stairs, order continues its performance, labeled boxes, furniture wrapped in plastic children's books tied with twine in neat, affectionate bundles. A house rehearsing its own innocence. The smell is stronger now, brushed with metal and damp fabric, and something that suggests a body's long surrender to stillness. On the far wall sits a wardrobe that is far too new to belong to the rest of this curated past. Its feet have carved pale arcs into the concrete soap-curved grooves that record a history of dragging. Claire touches the wardrobe's flank. It is cool with intention. Together, she and Selena shoulder it aside. The scrape echoes in the room like a breath pulled painfully between teeth. Behind it, a door that does not belong in a suburban basement. Industrial bolted the color of stormwater. The smell loosens from behind it like a confession. Claire's gloved hands count the bolts. Metal complains. One by one, the latches step back. The door opens. The flashlights hesitate as if beams too can feel dread. There is a small square of darkness inside. Concrete, narrow as a confession booth with a stained mattress that remembers every hour it has absorbed. A bucket with its black mouth yawning in the corner. The walls carry scratches that have been asked to be permanent. Time lives here with no calendar. She is in the far corner, folded into the shape of endurance. Knees pulled close arms, around them head tilted toward a wall as if listening for a frequency that no longer broadcasts. Skin the color of paper left under a bed. Hair long grayed by dust and months, maybe years of night that refused to end. Her eyes are open, but not receiving. The room inhales when Claire steps in. The beam of light softens around the face. There is no cry, no flinch. A chain lies coiled near a bolt like a word abandoned mid-sentence. On the ridge of the woman's collarbone, something catches the light, a sliver of silver leaf, a maple, small and stubborn as a memory. Her necklace. Names arrive first in the mind, clumsy, hopeful victim survivor, Jane Doe. But the necklace is a door of its own. The woman breathes like someone who is borrowing air from a stranger. When the paramedics lift her, the blanket is lighter than it should be. Bones draw careful lines beneath fabric. She lets herself be carried because gravity is a country she used to know. They rise up the stairs, and the house feels taller for their passing. Outside, Lakeview continues its performance of an ordinary afternoon. Wind folds a flag. A child's bicycle ticks as it cools on a lawn. The world is not required to stop when a story splits open. In the language of broadcasts and thumbnails, this would be the moment to announce what has been found. For those who are listening now, for those who feel how quickly a life can slip from notice, for those who want true stories that turn on the hinge of a single opened door, subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. There are corners of human nature that prefer dim light. We will bring a lamp. In the fluorescent hum of a hospital corridor, the swift work of identification begins with the grace of a ritual and the speed of a machine. Fingerprints answer a question that the eyes cannot. The result arrives small and devastating in its simplicity. Emily Carter, missing from Lakeview 9 years ago. 19 at the time. First-year student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A database lights up with old posters and colder notes. A mother's phone number is still there as if it had been waiting with its coat on. News moves like weather. A headline learns the shape of urgency: missing student found alive in social worker's basement. The town reforms itself around the story it had once set aside. Maple Drive becomes a pilgrimage of cameras. Neighbors practice interviews in the kitchen and decide that silence is safer. Parents count the hours of their daughters' commutes and do not mention why. Emily sleeps beneath a slow constellation of monitors. Nurses speak in the grammar of care, quiet, efficient, present. When she wakes, she looks first not at faces but at the window where evening has begun to loosen the day's light. Snow is out of season, but a soft brightness blooms on the glass from the hospital's own lamps, and it is enough for now. She is in a room with switches. She is somewhere that obeys the idea of a door. Memory is a house you return to carrying a flashlight that sometimes refuses to work. The beam sweeps, catches, edges, misses the center of the room, yet corners step forward. It had been one of those Lakeview Junes that arrive gently and promise a do-over. Emily was 19, the age that balances between ambition and doubt like a tightrope walker with a shy smile. She packed a small bag, the kind meant for weekends that mean no harm. She said she would visit her aunt in Madison. She said Sunday. She said, "Don't wait up." Her phone was a practical object, an old Nokia with a scuffed case, its battery a faithful dog that sometimes slept too long. At home, the kitchen clock ticked with parental certainty. Teresa Carter prepared for a night shift, the smell of coffee speaking for her. Thomas Reed wore his authority like a pressed shirt. Each sentence of his seemed to ask a test you had not studied for. He liked rules the way some men like fishing for the quiet and the control. Emily and Jake Nolan had argued the night before, but young love has tides that are as seasonal as the town itself. She had stood on her porch with her arms folded not as a barrier, but as a brace. He had wanted words to fix what neither of them could name. He had the look of a musician. After the song ends too soon, hands empty the air around him, embarrassed by silence. In the morning, he walked her to the bus stop, not quite touching, as if proximity might earn forgiveness on credit. The bus's doors had opened like a small theater curtain. She stepped on with the sense that she was doing something sensible. The sky had the color of possibility. This is how a life turns no thunder, just a hinge. The phone stopped answering towers an hour after departure. The map of her day lost its blue dot. In the first 24 hours, no one panicked. Her aunt waited. Teresa worked the night without knowing she had traded a daughter's schedule for a decade of questions. Jake paced a room, then a street, then a town, learning the geography of not knowing. An elderly neighbor swore she saw Emily the next morning walking with a man who wore glasses and the attitude of a shadow. The detail entered the file the way a seed enters soil, as a promise and a dare. Lakeview rehearsed concern, then fatigue. Missing posters wrinkled in the humidity of July, their corners curling the way paper does when it wants to go home. Tips arrived with the confidence of dreams. Students moved back to campus. The bus stop forgot her name. The investigation learned its first bad habit. It stared at Jake. The reason was as old as any town proximity youth a public temper on a winter night months before. The second interview found him tired and imprecise. He remembered differently under fluorescent lights. The story of where he walked on the night she vanished grew vague at the edges, his phone painting a path that looked less like an alibi and more like a worry pacing itself thin. Thomas Reed built a different alibi, the kind made of office hours and calendars signed by other men who liked order. It should have held like a good knot, and yet there were minutes unaccounted for stray threads that asked to be examined. In the Carter home, silence thickened into a varnish. Teresa dusted Emily's books in alphabetical obedience as if clean surfaces might call her daughter back. In private moments, she rested her hand on a bed that kept the shape of a girl who had left without taking her imprint. And then Lakeview did what towns do when a story resists completion. It filed the pain in a dark drawer and kept moving. People have grocery lists, mortgage payments. The dog needs shots. Compassion becomes a scheduled chore, then a memory, then an anecdote offered at safe distances. A photograph of Emily found a corner on the station's corkboard and stayed to watch years go by. The odor in Mark Lewandowski's basement would not become part of the myth for almost a decade. Meanwhile, Mark perfected the liturgy of public service. He became the kind of man whose emails are answered. He shook hands with people who needed to be seen and made them feel they had been. On Sundays, he carried boxes to trunks while cameras appreciated his posture. He learned that in the right suit, virtue can be confused with visibility. Back in the hospital, present tense regained air. Emily slept and woke and learned the hours again, how minute hands are loyal, how seconds forgive and renew. When she looked at the ceiling, she was a cartographer tracing new borders. The nurses turned her gently fed her soups that remembered heat and called her by her name with the patience you reserve for a precious object long mislaid. Outside her door, Claire Raddick began a new map of the old case, laying down points of light in a pattern that the town had refused to believe. She marked the bus time. She marked the phone's last breath. She underlined the neighbor's description of a man who preferred to dissolve into crowds. She wrote a single sentence on a blank page. Someone was practicing invisibility. The smell of Maple Drive had traveled with her phantom persuasive, impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't stood in that concrete throat of stairs. It was not rot alone. It was time-condensed breath saved and spent in the same square of air, the woolen sour of blankets that had the audacity to insist on keeping someone alive. She knew that odors could testify. She knew that houses tell the truth eventually, and in a building across town, a system, not a person, prepared its own confession. A routine audit would soon find a name on a list where it did not belong, an old case stamped active under the hand of a man who never forgot to smile for photographs. But that is the next hour's business. For now, the town, the house, and the hospital take a collective breath. The wardrobe has moved. The door has opened. A life has returned to the visible world, slender as a candle, brighter than anyone deserves to be in a city that almost forgot how to look. The Carter house breathed shallowly as though each room had agreed to hold its breath. Curtains stayed drawn even when the afternoon sun begged for entry. Dust lay evenly across picture frames, the kind of neatness that wasn't care, but surrender. Teresa Carter moved through her home like someone moving underwater, slow and deliberate, touching objects not to use them but to confirm they still existed. Emily's room remained exactly as it had been 9 years earlier. A stack of textbooks from a freshman semester gone sour sat on the desk waiting for an exam that would never come. On the dresser, a green scarf embroidered with small flowers hung limply, collecting both dust and regret. Teresa dusted these surfaces daily, the act more ritual than cleaning. Thomas Reed, her husband, lived in the same house but seemed to float above it, never quite touching the floorboards. He left for work early, returned late, and closed himself into his study where light never escaped. When questioned by Detective Claire, he offered timelines crisp as folded paper, office hours, errands, meetings. Each explanation was precise. and yet there were moments, thin gaps of unclaimed minutes that felt like the missing tiles in a mosaic. At the dinner table, the clink of silverware was louder than any conversation. Emily's empty chair was an accusation they all pretended not to hear. Jake Nolan walked through town with his head down and hands buried in his pockets. Conversation stuttered when he entered a store. Once he had been the boy with a guitar slung over his shoulder, a smile half-formed like a song that hadn't reached its chorus. Now he was an unanswered question. The night Emily vanished had carved a before and after into his life. At first, he told the police everything when he had last seen her, the argument they had how she boarded the bus without looking back. His first statement was raw trembling. The second one was cleaner too clean, and in its precision, he lost something vital: believability. Data didn't help him. His phone's location history painted a map that suggested restlessness rather than innocence. Between 7 p.m. and midnight, he had moved through multiple parts of town with no calls, made no texts, sent only silence and motion. The town remembered a winter party months before Emily's disappearance, a fight that had escalated too quickly. Jake's temper was now an easy hook for suspicion. He became the character in a play everyone agreed to know: the jealous boyfriend, the hidden violence. He avoided mirrors now, as if even his own reflection might testify against him. In the hospital, Emily's body began to reclaim itself. Muscles trembled when asked to stand. Light felt like a foreign language her eyes were relearning. Nurses marked progress in small victories: a sip of water, a coherent glance. But inside her mind, the basement remained. Memory did not return in linear chapters, but in fragments like shards of glass swept into a corner. She remembered the sound of the lock more vividly than any voice. The heavy metallic click that ended a day before it began. At first, she had screamed. Then, she had whispered, reciting childhood songs, the names of streets, the titles of books. She had scratched days into the wall until her fingers bled, losing count after 27. She remembered a voice through the crack in the door. Calm, measured. "It's complicated, Emily. Someday you'll understand." She never understood. And there was another sound, once faint, overlapping a second pair of footsteps retreating down the hall. That sound lived at the edge of her memory, waiting for context she didn't yet have. Sad. In an office far from Maple Drive, Paula Jenkins stayed late, surrounded by screens and spreadsheets. She was the kind of auditor who noticed anomalies the way others notice a change in weather. The list on her monitor was routine names of individuals receiving long-term social assistance. Most were elderly, some were ill, many forgotten, but one name halted her hand: Emily Carter, status active. Last payment verified 3 years after her disappearance. The verification signature was neat professional, Mark Lewandowski. Paula frowned. Cases sometimes lagged behind reality, but 3 years was too long, too deliberate. She searched deeper and found other names tied to Mark's caseload: people marked as unreachable, relocated, or deceased without proper documentation. The pattern formed like cracks spreading across glass. Each name a fault line. Paula printed the report, the paper warm against her palm. She didn't know what it meant, yet only that someone was using the invisibility of the forgotten to build something dangerous. Detective Claire spread photos across her desk. Emily at 19. The bus stop, camera stills. The neighbor's statement. She drew a circle around the description: tall man, thin, glasses. For weeks, all eyes had been on Jake. But as Paula's report reached her desk, a new silhouette began to emerge. Mark Lewandowski, social worker, beloved volunteer, known for his tireless outreach to the elderly and vulnerable. A man whose job gave him access to the very population disappearing from Paula's spreadsheets. Claire compared a photo of Mark at a charity event to the composite sketch from 9 years ago. The likeness was not perfect, but it was enough to tighten her chest. Mark had been present in the story all along, but in the role of helper, not villain. That was his disguise. Goodness so public, it blinded scrutiny. Shed. The second search of Mark's house happened under the authority of a warrant. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering like leaves in a restless wind. Inside, everything was orderly again, too orderly. Claire moved with deliberate steps, her flashlight grazing surfaces like a judge's gavel. In a locked drawer of Mark's study, they found the files. Dozens of manila folders labeled with names that matched Paula's list. Each folder contained forged documents, payment records, case notes that painted careful lies. At the back was a folder marked simply EC. Inside Emily's ID photo, a timeline of her disappearance and a handwritten note clipped to the bottom. 2 words: exposure, contain. The room seemed to contract around that phrase. It was not a plan. It was a reflex, an instinct to silence a threat. Dead. Claire returned to the basement alone, needing to stand in the space where Emily had been kept. The wardrobe had been moved aside again, the door open. The smell lingered through fainter now, like the ghost of breath. She imagined Emily counting days, whispering songs, clinging to the thin thread of memory. As Claire traced her gloved hand along the wall, she felt the case expand beyond one victim. The other folders were proof there were more stories buried under the town's clean sidewalks. She turned off her flashlight and stood in darkness for a moment. It was not total, not like what Emily had endured, but it was enough to understand why silence could be a weapon. When she opened her eyes, resolve replaced fear. The break came from a camera no one had thought to check. A gas station 30 miles outside Lakeview captured a grainy figure at an ATM. The date stamp was from 2 nights ago. The man was tall, thin, wearing glasses, carrying a black duffel bag. Mark Lewandowski had fled. Claire stared at the screen, the static crawling like ants over his image. The town had spent 9 years watching the wrong people. Now the right man was slipping away into the world. The hunt would begin at dawn. For those listening, for those who follow true stories where justice is not inevitable but must be chased through shadows, subscribe now so you do not miss the next turn in this unfolding truth. Each click is a promise to keep looking even when the town looks away. Dawn scraped its pale fingernails across Lakeview as officers fanned out their cars like chess pieces moved by unseen hands. Mark Lewandowski had been gone for 2 nights. The air smelled of rain and inevitability. Claire rode in silence beside Selena. The highway unfurled like a ribbon of cold gray billboards flashing offers to a world Mark no longer deserved. They found him at a train station 3 towns away. Cameras caught the stoop of his shoulders, the duffel bag swinging like a pendulum of guilt. He moved with deceptive calm, as though errands had simply taken him further than planned. When Claire stepped onto the platform, the world slowed. Mark glanced over his shoulder. Recognition flared, then calculation. He ran. Rain turned the chase slick and breathless. Commuters gasped and stepped aside. Claire's shoes struck puddles like fists. At the end of a narrow alley, Mark stopped. There was nowhere left to go but backward, and Claire blocked that path. He dropped the bag. His voice was low. Even I never meant for it to go this far. The words hung like steam in the cold morning air. In the interrogation room, Mark's face was no longer the face of a beloved social worker. It was stripped bare, a map of fear and fatigue. Claire sat across from him, steady as stone. He spoke slowly, like someone telling a story to himself. She heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. I was outside the bus station making a call. She was standing there waiting. Our eyes met. I knew she'd heard enough to ruin everything. His hands twitched against the tabletop. I told myself it was temporary. A week, maybe 2. I just needed time to fix the problem. But weeks became months. Months became years. She stopped talking, stopped fighting. It was like she disappeared even before I locked the door. Claire asked about the others, the names in his files. He shifted his gaze to the wall. Silence was his final defense. Mark had given them the story of Emily's captivity, but not the full picture. There was a gap, a shadow behind his words. Claire sensed another presence, someone higher, someone who had made Mark necessary. The truth was close enough to taste bitter on her tongue. At the hospital, Emily sat by the window, a blanket pulled around her legs. Snow flurries drifted outside, though the calendar insisted it was spring. Memory came in flashes now, sharper than before. She closed her eyes and listened not to the present, but to the echoes stored inside her bones. The voice of Mark, calm and careful. It's complicated. The sound of the lock, turning the metallic click like punctuation at the end of a sentence. And then another sound. Fainter. A footstep retreating paired with the soft swish of fabric. A different rhythm, one she had once known well. Her throat tightened. A scent accompanied the memory, the sharp, clean tang of a particular soap. Thomas Reed used that soap. Emily opened her eyes. The hospital room tilted slightly, as if the building had leaned closer to hear her secret. Claire returned to her desk with Mark's confession still ringing in her ears. She spread the files like tarot cards. The names of the missing stared back at her. Paula Jenkins arrived with additional records. Together they traced payment signatures and case approvals, following the paper trail like a thread through a labyrinth. And there it was, Thomas Reed's signature stamped on several authorizations connected to Mark's fraudulent accounts. Not just a bureaucratic oversight. Patterns revealed intention. Thomas had provided cover for Mark's scheme, ensuring the state system looked elsewhere while people vanished. Claire leaned back, the ceiling swimming above her. For 9 years, Thomas had sat at the family's table, comforting Teresa, pretending grief. He had been a shepherd, guiding the investigation away from his own tracks. The betrayal cut deeper than any single crime. Night fell like a curtain over the Carter home. Claire arrived with 2 officers, their presence quiet but undeniable. Teresa opened the door, confusion shadowing her face. Behind her, Thomas appeared in the hallway, holding himself with the same stiff dignity he always wore. Claire spoke his name. It was not a question. It was a verdict. Thomas froze. In that stillness, Teresa understood. The breath left her body in a soundless exhale. When Thomas moved, it was sudden, a step backward toward his study, toward whatever escape he imagined. Officers surged forward. The moment cracked open. Teresa reached for Emily's scarf hanging by the door, clutching it like a lifeline. Claire's voice was steady as the storm outside. It's over. The house, which had swallowed so many silences, finally had to listen. In holding cells on opposite sides of the station, Mark and Thomas sat in matching postures. Heads lowered, hands idle, futures sealed. The town reeled. For years it had believed the monster lived outside, only to learn he had been sitting at the dinner table offering grace before meals. Teresa visited Emily at the hospital. Her daughter looked at her with eyes too old for their age. Emily's voice was quiet but unflinching. He was right. No one was looking for me. The words fell like a final stone into deep water. Outside, Claire prepared for what came next. A trial, a reckoning, and the long work of restoring what had been stolen. But she knew some losses could never be repaid. The town would tell itself the story of Mark Lewandowski for years. Few would speak Thomas Reed's name aloud. Some truths are too large to fit into conversation, and in Emily's silence, the darkest truth of all remained. The courthouse was a building meant to hold order, yet that morning it felt too small for the truths it would contain. Cameras lined the steps outside their lenses like a swarm of unblinking eyes. The town of Lakeview gathered in the square not for celebration, but to witness the unmasking of its own blindness. Inside, the air carried the sharp tang of paper and anxiety. Reporters shuffled pages while jurors sat rigid as statues. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mark Lewandowski was led in first. The man who had once delivered groceries to the elderly now moved like a shadow dragged unwillingly into daylight. His suit hung loose on his frame, the threadbare symbol of a goodness that had been nothing more than a costume. Minutes later, Thomas Reed entered. Unlike Mark, he still carried himself with the dignity of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of appearances. Yet, the stiffness of his shoulders betrayed him. Behind him, Teresa walked slowly to her seat, each step an act of survival. Emily was there, too pale, a scarf around her neck, hands folded tightly in her lap. She sat as if occupying a fragile body borrowed from someone else. The charges were read aloud. The words fell heavy: unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault, fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. Each accusation was a stone laid on the table for all to see. Witnesses spoke, their voices trembling. Social workers who had once praised Mark now admitted the doubts they had buried. Paula Jenkins presented the paper trail, each signature a thread in the web Thomas had spun. Claire testified with the clarity of someone who had walked through both darkness and denial. Emily was never asked to speak. Her silence was more powerful than any testimony could have been. When the prosecutor gestured toward her, the room turned and saw a living ghost returned from the basement of the world. That was enough. When the verdicts came, they were unanimous. Both men guilty on all counts. Sentences were read with the finality of a door slamming shut. Mark lowered his head. Thomas did not move at all. Endured. Recovery was not a straight road, but a winding path of uneven stones. Emily walked it slowly, sometimes crawling, sometimes carried by others. At first, she could not leave her hospital room. The sound of a door closing made her flinch. Shadows in corners became threats. Nurses learned to move softly, speaking her name as they entered. When she finally went home, her new apartment was kept spare and simple. A chair, a blanket folded carefully, a plant by the window. She taped a small piece of paper to the refrigerator. On it, she had written 4 words. "You are still here." Therapy began 3 times. The first time she left before the hour was done. The second, she sat in silence while the therapist waited, pen poised but never used. On the third visit, words emerged like hesitant birds. "I forgot how to want anything." The therapist nodded a quiet acknowledgement that wanting could come later. For now, survival was enough. Emily spent mornings by the window watching people below. Dogs pulling leashes, children with backpacks, couples laughing or arguing. She wondered if they knew how easily the world could lose someone and keep walking as if nothing had changed. At night, she kept a small lamp glowing. Darkness would never again be allowed to own her. Teresa visited often, bringing soup or simply sitting in silence. Mother and daughter were relearning each other like 2 survivors of different storms meeting on the same shore. One evening, Teresa clasped a mug between trembling hands. "I should have asked more questions," she whispered. "I should have fought harder." Emily reached across the table and placed her hand over her mother's. No words were exchanged, but forgiveness stirred quietly in that touch, imperfect yet present. Jake came by too, always announcing himself first, never staying long. He brought records, once music they had once shared. They listened without speaking, the melodies filling spaces that words could not. One afternoon, Emily asked softly, "Did you ever think I was dead?" Jake paused. "No," he said finally. "I thought you were somewhere waiting." Emily nodded, a small acknowledgement that hope had been alive in more than one heart. On a cool evening, Emily walked alone to the bus station. It was the same place where her life had been split into before and after. The benches were newer, now the paint less chipped, but the rhythm of doors opening and closing remained unchanged. She stood on the platform as buses arrived and departed. Travelers with duffel bags hurried past, voices mingling in a chorus of journeys. A girl in a red scarf reminded her of the one she had worn that night long ago. Emily sat on a bench and closed her eyes. The sounds of engines and footsteps blended into a hum that no longer held menace. She breathed deeply. When a bus pulled up with a hiss, its doors opening like a mechanical yawn, Emily rose. She stepped forward as if to board, then stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and walked away into the evening light. The station remained behind her, a relic of captivity she no longer carried. Dundee. Months passed. The town healed in visible and invisible ways. Laws were rewritten. Oversight tightened. Lakeview would never again look at a smiling public servant without also seeing the shadow behind him. Emily's healing was quieter. It was choosing her own fruit at the corner store without scanning for exits. It was laughing once unexpectedly at a television joke. It was the slow return of ordinary moments that had been stolen. On a late summer evening, she sat on her balcony wrapped in a thick cardigan sipping tea. Jake sat beside her with a book, neither of them speaking. The sunset painted the sky in colors Emily had nearly forgotten. She turned to him and asked, "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like?" If none of it had happened, Jake thought for a long moment. Sometimes, he admitted. But then, I remember we're here now. That's all that matters. Emily smiled. Not a wide smile, but a real one. It said, "I see you. I'm still here, Hedda." Ich see it. And as Emily's story closes, so does our journey. In the deepest dark, she found the strength to return to light. Stories like hers remind us that survival is not about going back to who we were, but becoming someone new, scars and all. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you pause to think, subscribe. Now. Together, we can keep exploring the hidden corners of human nature, uncovering truths too important to remain buried. Because every time you choose to listen, you promise never to look away again.